Again, Leonov wants us to believe that scientists in Moscow picked up signals from the lunar module as it descended to the moon and the television transmissions that followed. This reception would have been an amazing feat if true, because at the time of the lunar landing, Moscow was on the far side of the Earth, the side facing away from the moon. As you can see from this map, Moscow is located on the western edge of Russia, near Eastern Europe. Here is a diagram. It shows the Earth as seen from the moon at 2018 Greenwich Mean Time, Sunday, July 20th, 1969, the moment Eagle landed at Tranquility Base. As you can see, or rather can't see, Moscow is on the side facing away from the moon, and is therefore not visible from the moon. If we zoom in, we can just make out Italy clearly on the edge of the Earth's circumference, further indicating that Moscow is not in line of sight with the moon. Remember, to track a signal from space, the transmitter and transceiver must both be in line of sight. Just as radio telescopes can't track spacecrafts when their orbits take them behind the moon, these telescopes also can't pick up these transmissions when Earth rotates the tracking stations out of view. So how is it possible that Leonov and his team could have tracked Apollo 11 from Moscow? We can also prove that Moscow would still be out of sight when it was time for the one small step.
This diagram shows the Earth as seen from the Moon at the beginning of the Apollo 11 moonwalk.
As you can clearly see, mostly the Pacific Ocean is facing the Moon at this time, and the only tracking stations in line of sight are Goldstone, Honeysuckle Creek, and Parkes, all of which are part of NASA's Deep Space Network. Again, Moscow is quite clearly not visible, and therefore, quite literally, is in no position to receive signals from the Moon. The only way Moscow could have received these signals is if there were a geostationary satellite orbiting Earth to relay them to Mother Russia. But in that case, they wouldn't be able to prove that these signals came from the Moon, because they would only be able to track the transmissions from geostationary orbit, not cislunar space. Most important of all, why would a Russian cosmonaut attempt to cover for the United States when the US were their archenemy? The same archenemy who since 1963 has been supplying them with tons of American wheat and to this day are now working together on joint space missions. ASTP, Mir, and the ISS, just to name a few. Alexei Leonov, I speak directly to you here. Here is a diagram. It shows the Earth as seen from the Moon at the moment the Eagle touched down. Here is another diagram. It shows the Earth as seen from the Moon when Armstrong took his small step. Here is a pen. Now, you show me where Moscow can be seen on these two maps. Interestingly, in defense of Leonov, some have suggested that Leonov was not receiving images from the Moon, but simply watching the TV show that the rest of the world was watching. In that case, he should not be cited as having tracked Apollo, as other people have done. During the editing of this video, Webb released another video. In this video, Webb did show the testimonies of the ham radio operators we already discussed. Paul Wilson, Sever Gran, etc. He completely ignores my coverage of what these ham operators said, and alleges that my only option is to call them all liars.
Of all the sources that Jarrah could have used to provide the Soviet downlink info, he chose Sven's website, essentially leaving a cookie crumb trail directly to Sven's Apollo 17 adventure. Why would Jarrah do that if he didn't want some unobservant propagandist to find it? Jarrah's only recourse to discredit this evidence is to say that Sven, Flagg, and Greenman are liars. To insist that hams were not able to pick up Apollo signals, or would lie in their recounts of their exploits, is a sad, pathetic, desperate attempt by Jarrah White to remove a major roadblock to his ridiculous moon hoax claims.
This is a straw man of epic proportions. I have never claimed that the hams lied about anything. Oh, how I wish I knew back when I was making Exhibit D what I know now. Let me summarize. I do not deny that the radio hams received the data they claim to have received. What I question is whether these signals came from manned craft on the surface of the moon and in lunar orbit respectively, which are pretty much virtually the only places where hams claim to have tracked Apollo. Even the Paul Wilson that Webb refers to in the video stated, "The moon is always in view of NASA's primary tracking stations in Australia, Spain and California, but not so for the amateur. Some of the most exciting events and transmissions from the Apollo mission always seem to occur when the moon is below the horizon for the continental United States amateur. Nevertheless, 5 lunar parking orbits and several hours of return trip transmissions were observed by this experimenter." I'm also interested in the data that the FCC won't let these hams release. But that's another story. The fact is, none of these hams claim to have tracked it all the way to the moon and back. For Webb to allege that my only option is to call all these hams liars is itself a lie. Webb knows perfectly well what my stance regarding the radio hams is. He had to know, because I explicitly discussed the hams that Webb mentioned in my Apollo ham sandwich video, a good portion of which was played in my Australia and the Conspirators video. Going by these regulations, I pointed out that hams could not possibly have picked up Apollo's signals. After my video was posted on Joe Rogan's forum, members posted links to various radio hams who claimed to have tracked Apollo, namely Paul Wilson, Richard Nadel, and Seven Gran. I read deep into all of their testimonies, and they all had one thing in common. None of them can attest to having tracked these vehicles all the way to the moon and back, as trolls like Shane Killian have falsely claimed.
As well as hundreds of amateur astronomers and radio enthusiasts who claim to have tracked the Apollo spacecraft all the way to the moon?
In fact, it wasn't until Apollo 15 that they even picked up voices. The hams can only attest to having tracked Apollo when it was on or near the moon, and if they're lucky, a few hours of return signals on the ride home. This is nothing that can't be pulled off with an unmanned craft to either relay data from low orbit or transmit pre-recorded information. The last 2 sources cited at Joe Rogan's forum were Carnarvon Tracking Station and Honeysuckle Creek, both of which are NASA facilities and thus should not be counted as independent verification. Just to give a quick recap, Paul Wilson claims to have picked up signals from Apollos 10, 12, 14 and 15 when they were in lunar orbit, plus a few hours of signals during Apollo 15's return voyage. He also claims to have picked up Apollo 16 just before it entered lunar orbit and while it was in lunar orbit. Richard Nadel claims he picked up Apollo 15 in lunar orbit and some of the signals broadcast on the ride home. Seven Gran claims he picked up Apollo 17 during its various passes over his head, then for reasons unknown stopped tracking the signals and resumed only when the craft was in lunar orbit. Further, it wasn't until Apollo 15 that Wilson actually received voice signals, and the FCC declared it illegal for hams to inform the world of any communications not intended for public view. And it seems that none of the hams who found a way to tune their dishes to Apollo's signal can attest to having tracked these vehicles all the way to the moon and back. Given that these guys tracked very little data, if any, It's possible that these signals they received were from unmanned probes respectively on the Moon and in lunar orbit, which either broadcasted pre-recorded signals or relayed transmissions that were beamed to them from Earth orbit. And given that no one was tracking these probes all the way to the Moon, who would know if they were already up there in advance? And let's not forget, with the FCC policing what hams can and cannot disclose to the public, the truth behind Apollo is as good as buried. Just how many hams do you suppose have evidence of a hoax and are keeping silent over fear of prosecution?